The billionaire CEO slammed his fist on the table, his voice echoing across the glass walls. "No one here has the courage to challenge me," he roared, daring anyone to speak. His boardroom fell silent until the new cook, still wearing his apron, stepped forward. And in that silence, the giant was finally humbled. The boardroom towered above the city, its walls of glass showing a skyline bathed in evening light. Suits filled the long polished table, every executive too afraid to raise their eyes. At the head sat Victor Harlan, the billionaire CEO. His empire stretched across continents, his power unquestioned, his arrogance legendary. He enjoyed watching fear in the faces of those who worked beneath him. This evening his words dripped with venom. He mocked the timid suggestions of his executives, tore apart the presentations they had prepared, and boasted about his fortune as though it made him untouchable. "Without me," he sneered, "none of you would even exist in this world." His laughter rolled across the room, heavy and cruel. But from the hallway outside, another man had been listening. The scent of roasted garlic still clung to his apron, and his hands carried faint burns from the kitchen stove. His name was Elijah. Just weeks earlier, he had been hired as a cook in the company cafeteria, an invisible figure to those in fine suits. Tonight, he had come to deliver trays of food for the late meeting. Yet what he saw and heard froze him in place. Elijah knew arrogance when he saw it. He had seen it in different forms before. On the streets where he grew up, in the war zones where he had once served, in the hospitals where he had sat by his mother's bed when illness claimed her strength. But arrogance in a man with power was the most dangerous of all. He pushed the door open, the clatter of trays drawing eyes to him. A ripple of irritation crossed Victor's face. "You're late," the CEO snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "Leave it and go. This isn't your world." Elijah placed the trays down, his movements calm. He did not speak. But in his silence, in the steadiness of his gaze, the air in the room began to shift. Executives glanced between the two men, sensing something they couldn't yet name. Elijah's backstory was written not in wealth, but in sacrifice. He had grown up the son of a dock worker, the smell of salt water and diesel in his lungs. At 18, he enlisted, trading the chaos of his city for the discipline of service. He fought in deserts where the heat burned through his armor, where silence meant survival. He carried brothers from rubble, wrote letters for those who never made it home. His return to civilian life was marked by empty chairs at his family table, by the absence of his mother's laugh, by nights where hunger visited often. But even in hardship, Elijah carried himself with dignity. He never shouted, never begged, never bent. His silence was his shield, and his resilience his weapon. Now, standing in the boardroom of a billionaire, that same silence filled the space. Victor sneered, mistaking it for weakness. "What?" he mocked. "Do you have something to say, cook? Do you think you're better than the men at this table?" Still, Elijah did not speak. He only reached for the remote that controlled the boardroom screen, left carelessly near the trays. He pressed a button, and the giant screen behind Victor flickered to life. Gasps broke the silence. It was not a corporate chart or a financial report that appeared, but photos Elijah had found earlier in the kitchen news broadcast. Headlines blazed across the screen. Workers strike over unpaid wages. Images of exhausted men and women holding signs, their faces worn, their dignity ignored. They were Victor's employees, those whose lives were crushed beneath the weight of his empire. The room stilled. Executives shifted uneasily. Victor's jaw clenched. "Turn that off," he barked. But Elijah stood firm, his silence louder than any protest. Finally he spoke, his voice deep, steady, unshakable. "Respect is not bought. It is earned." The words struck the room like a thunderclap. Victor leaned forward, rage boiling. But in the eyes of his executives, something had shifted. They were no longer watching their CEO. They were watching the cook, the man who had dared to stand. For the first time, the giant at the head of the table looked small. Elijah continued, his words few but sharp. "Power without respect is weakness, and silence in the face of injustice," he said, sweeping his gaze across the executives, "is agreement." The room erupted, not in anger, but in applause. It began softly, a few hands clapping at the far end of the table, then grew into a swell of sound that filled the boardroom. Men and women who had stayed silent for years now stood in solidarity. Victor's face paled, his arrogance shattered not by argument but by truth. Elijah set the remote down. He removed his apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. "I don't need your table," he said quietly. "I only need my dignity, and I will never serve a man who doesn't respect those who build his empire." With that, he turned to leave. But before he reached the door, the chief financial officer rose to his feet. Then the head of operations. One by one, the executives stood, their silence no longer submission but rebellion. They had found courage not in their titles, but in the cook who reminded them of their worth. Victor sat alone at the head of his polished table, surrounded by empty chairs and the echo of his own fading power. Downstairs, in the cafeteria, workers greeted Elijah with respect in their eyes. They had heard. Word had spread like fire about the cook who stood tall when no one else dared. That night, Elijah walked home through streets lit by neon, the weight of the city pressing down, yet somehow lighter than before. He had not planned to challenge a billionaire. He had only lived by the code he always carried. Silent strength is the loudest voice. And in the weeks that followed, the company changed. Employees spoke louder, board members demanded fairness, and Victor's arrogance dimmed under the pressure of unity. Because one cook had reminded them all of a truth no empire could silence. Respect is the foundation of power. Without it, a king is just a man sitting alone at a table. So what about you? What part of this story stirred your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe in the power of silent heroes, subscribe now, because sometimes the quietest voices carry the greatest power.